couple of years ago, my friend Alex decided that his bachelor party was going to be in Austin, Texas. The idea of spending an entire weekend there sounded like pure adventure, really. There were 7 of us friends in total, including the groom-to-be. We all got down to business and rented a great house for the long weekend. From there, it was only a minute's hop to the nightlife of the city, but the drive to Austin was something else, so we had to plan everything for months. In fact, that brought us a lot closer together, and in the process I made good chemistry with several of the people who were going to be at the wedding, especially Stuart. Stuart was a real character. He was always bursting with energy and ready to party, although he could be a bit intense at times, but he claimed that was his charm. Stuart and I had known each other since college, but we weren't that close, however. Throughout this process, we became very good friends. At first, we just got together for drinks and to agree on the trip, but soon what started out as that turned into nights of partying, playing games, and talking about things that weren't necessarily just about Alex's wedding. Stuart was a free soul. We would go out partying, and he was always looking for a way to be the center of attention, whether it was dancing on the bar or flirting with someone. He had a life is a party attitude that I kind of admired. But when we got to Austin, something started to not add up. While we were there, I began to doubt whether bringing Stuart had been a good idea, although it pained me to think about it, because I really liked him. But ever since we got there, he seemed to be out of control. I mean, there was never an end to the party for him, and he definitely had no limits on his drinking, so my instinct was telling me this could end in disaster. One night, he climbed up on the bar like he was an expert, but within 2 seconds he fell over and got a nice big bump on his head. He didn't seem to be hurt, but it was a disaster, and we almost got kicked out of the bar. During the same night, he also started arguing with some of the other people at the party, and Alex felt very uncomfortable, so he decided it was best to go back to the house to avoid any more trouble. Stuart, on the other hand, was in a "we can't leave now, we're in Austin" vibe, as if we wanted to stay home instead of going out to enjoy ourselves. I tried to make him see that we were there to have a good time and that it wasn't all about what he wanted, but Stuart didn't care. He even told us we were boring and that he would stay and keep the party going. Alex, of course, was furious and suggested we leave it there and go home. I told Stu to let me know when he needed a ride back to the house and that I would see that he got there, yes or yes. He was a little dismissive, but in the end, we turned away from the bar and continued drinking and playing Wii Sports in the house we rented. You won't believe it, but that turned out to be one of the highlights of the trip. It was relaxed and fun, and we all had a lot of laughs. I had forgotten about Stuart until around 4 a.m. when I decided to get up and check my phone. I had a message from him from 2:30 a.m. with a picture of him making a fool of himself and half naked with a group of girls and a guy, all pointing at the camera. To some, that might sound alarming, but believe me, it was the most normal thing he could send us. I tried to call him, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sent him a couple more messages and nothing. I got a little nervous and started checking around the house to see if he was asleep somewhere. But to my horror, he wasn't. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't know what to do. I didn't quite know what to do, so around 6 in the morning I woke up some of the guys and asked them what they thought about the situation. Truth be told, Stuart had been pretty rude to some of them the night before, including a friend's girlfriend, and most of them said to leave him alone. But regardless, I couldn't get it out of our heads that something might have happened to him. At the end of the day, he's one of those friends you can't just ignore. When Alex finally woke up, we still had no sign of Stuart. He started to get nervous because our flight was leaving later and we had to get ready to go to the airport. After a while discussing what to do, we decided it would be best to call the police just in case, but just as we were about to do that, he finally called us. He sounded confused, as if he was a little drunk or high, and started yelling at us, accusing us of being horrible friends and traitors and 10,000 other insults. He called us sons upwards, mentioning me directly, and I still don't even understand why. Trying to ignore his alcoholic or whatever outburst, we begged him to come back to take him to the airport because we had to leave, but he told us to go to hell. He could come back alone and no problem. After another good amount of insults, his last sentence was, "Leave me in Austin, you fuckers. Goodbye." Alex spent the whole afternoon trying to convince Stuart to come back, but there was no way. He turned off his location and blocked us all, so they ended up with no idea where to find him. We finally decided to leave Stuart behind and move on with our lives. A few days went by, and I honestly didn't think about him anymore. I talked to Alex several times about the situation, and he told me that he hadn't heard from Stuart either. He had no family in town, so we had no idea how to contact him to make sure he was okay. We looked him up on the internet and couldn't find anything either. We even went on missing persons and even death sites, but luckily there was nothing. In the end, we decided that wherever Stuart was, he didn't seem to want us to find him, and we just hoped he was okay. That was several months ago, but just last week I had an unexpected encounter with him, from which I am still trying to recover. Last Saturday, after work, I came home and decided to stay in instead of going out. It had been a long week, and I just wanted to relax with a shot of whiskey. My girlfriend was away on business, so I was going to be home alone. Around midnight, I decided it was time for bed, so I called my girlfriend to wish her good night, and while I was brushing my teeth, I decided to make a FaceTime video call. I placed my phone on a small piece of furniture in the bathroom, from where you could see the door and my room, and I was in the middle of a story with my girlfriend when she suddenly went quiet. I asked her if she was okay, and she said someone else was there. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but when I looked at the screen again, I saw her visibly pale, which was not normal for her. That's when I knew she was serious. My girlfriend sent me a text message asking me to leave the apartment immediately. She said she could see someone moving around in my closet. I tried not to panic and started putting on my shoes to get out of the bathroom. I looked towards my bedroom door and, to my relief, there was no one there. But suddenly Stuart appeared out of nowhere, looking completely unhinged and ready to attack. I said nothing and just looked at him, and he looked back at me, saying in a low, threatening voice, "You left me alone in Austin." I held up my hands, trying to calm the situation, because it was very obvious that he was not in his better judgment. Stuart looked really bad. His eyes were red and wild, his hair was disheveled, and his clothes were dirty. He seemed to be under the effects of something, but most of all, his attitude was really scary. While I was managing to deal with Stuart, my girlfriend was still talking on the phone, and without waiting a second, she called her roommate and asked her to call the police to send someone to my house as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Stuart was still there, standing in front of me, breathing heavily, and looking at me with those devilish eyes. I tried to tell him everything we did to try to find him, but he interrupted me by repeating the phrase, but this time with more anger. "You left me alone in Austin," and took a step toward me. This time, it sounded even more frightening than before. Stuart was wearing a sweatshirt and had both hands stuffed in his front pocket. He was about my height, 6'2" or so, and he was also athletic, so if he decided to come at me with blows, it would be an even fight. But I was pretty sure there was something in the pocket of his sweatshirt, a gun or a knife, I don't know, but I panicked and decided to run out of the room. Stuart chased after me, yelling the same thing over and over again. He seemed to be completely out of it, and as I ran for the door to call for help, he was right behind me and getting closer and closer. Suddenly, when I finally reached the front door, I saw the lights of a police car pulling up on the street. I immediately started waving at him in desperation, but Stuart didn't care in the least. The officer got out of the car just as Stuart knocked me down in front of him, pinning me to the grass in the yard. But fortunately, the officer acted fast and stopped Stuart almost instantly, without giving him time to assault me in any way. He was completely out of control, screaming and making noises I couldn't understand. Turns out I wasn't wrong. He was carrying a knife hidden in his hoodie, a huge one, %. I didn't really know if he just wanted to scare me or he really went to my house with the intention of killing me, but I'm very grateful to my girlfriend and that police officer, because thanks to them I didn't have to find out. Stuart was placed under arrest, but a few minutes after arriving at the police station, he collapsed on the floor and began convulsing. He was apparently suffering from an overdose and was immediately transported to the hospital. I decided not to press charges against him. Instead, among all his friends, we decided to hire an investigator to find out what happened to him. because it seems that Stuart had become a kind of shadow of himself, as if the real him was no longer there. I'm totally convinced that leaving him that night in Austin was the root of it all, but we don't know what really happened to him, or where he was all this time. At the time I am writing this, he is receiving psychological treatment in a specialized center, but his condition is really delicate, and so far he is not able to establish any coherent conversation. But we really pray to God that he recovers soon and can go on with his life. In the meantime, we can only wait and try to find answers. I grew up in a trailer park in a small town in Missouri, and my childhood and teenage years were pretty good. However, when I was 19, I moved to Philadelphia for college and realized how much I had been missing out on in life. This city had a lot of amazing things: fantastic nightlife, restaurants, museums, parks, and lots of opportunities to meet new people. Living in this place really made me happy. It was something completely different from my small town and offered me a lot of opportunities. It was here that I finally had my first love relationship. I had always been a plus-size girl, and in Missouri the single guys always ignored me. But in Philadelphia, there were a lot of great guys who could look past my weight and love me for who I am, or at least that's how I felt. Living here, I felt much less discriminated against and therefore much more open to experimenting and meeting new people. I met Mike at work and we were together for about 3 years. Truth be told, I thought he was the one. We were super comfortable talking about everything, and our relationship was good, but every time he asked me about my childhood, I would change the subject. Honestly, I was a little embarrassed to talk about my life at Stonehill. I mean, Mike didn't even know he was my first boyfriend. A couple of years ago, both he and I graduated and had the summer off before we started our new jobs. So Mike suggested we take a trip to Missouri so I could see where he was coming from. At first, I wasn't too convinced, but eventually I gave in. He booked the tickets and I made the hotel reservations because I didn't want to stay at my parents' house. Mike was born and raised in Philadelphia, so he was shocked at how small my town was, but in a good way. He said it was charming, like he was in a foreign country or something. We checked into the hotel, and then I gave him a tour of the main street. The whole time he kept asking me when I was going to introduce him to my family and friends. So one night I took him out to dinner with my parents and brothers. That was on our second night in my town, and when they saw me arrive with him, they were all shocked that a girl like me could date a guy as handsome and successful as Mike. They seemed very happy for us. But the next day Mike was still insisting that I introduce him to my lifelong friends. The truth is, there weren't many of them, and I had lost touch with almost all of them. And more than anything, I didn't want Mike to know what a loser I was in high school. He finally stopped pushing, but I could tell he was disappointed that I wouldn't get to meet my old friends. On the third day of our visit, we decided to have lunch at the only restaurant in my town, which luckily was empty except for us and the waitress, who seemed very happy to have customers that day. I was able to show Mike what an authentic Missouri restaurant was like, and everything was going great until Vilma showed up. She had been my best friend since high school, and we did everything together. But after I moved away, I started to realize that our friendship was pretty toxic. She used to make cruel jokes to me almost daily about my looks and always made fun of my weight. Vilma was always thin and pretty. I think she used me as her fat, unattractive friend to make herself look better to others. Seeing Vilma was the last thing I wanted to do on this visit. I didn't even tell her I was coming. So when I saw her come in, I tried to hide my face, hoping she wouldn't see me. But of course, it was impossible. She noticed me right away and didn't hesitate to approach. "Carla, is that you?" she shouted in her squeaky voice. In view of her effusiveness, I was forced to greet her and introduce her to Mike, who seemed excited to finally get to meet one of my friends from the past. Vilma sat next to me at the table, acting like we were still best friends, but it was all for show, and it was clear she just wanted to impress Mike. She started telling him embarrassing stories from my childhood, omitting all the ones where she was the reason for my embarrassment. I couldn't believe I was there, putting up with all that nonsense while Vilma went on with her tales trying to steal Mike's attention. Then she got to the story I most wanted to avoid. When we were younger, she had tricked me into skinny dipping with her in the creek and then arranged for someone to steal my clothes. I had never felt so embarrassed in my life, but she talked about it as if it were a very funny anecdote. Maybe it was for her, but not for me. But worst of all, Mike seemed completely hooked on her stories and laughing his head off with Vilma, not even noticing how uncomfortable I felt. Lunch dragged on and I could barely open my mouth. Mike kept asking Vilma questions, leading the conversation into more embarrassing anecdotes about me. The way Mike was looking at her was almost flirtatious, and I couldn't believe it. I was really outraged. I felt like she was trying to steal my boyfriend from me, and judging by how amused he was, it seemed to be working. We were done eating, so I told Vilma that it was great to see her again, but that my boyfriend and I had to go. Then, Mike asked her if she wanted to go to our hotel with us. "Of course I did," she replied, as she put her arm around my shoulder. I felt like throwing up. Is she serious? Lunch took forever waiting for the moment to get out of here and get rid of Vilma, and now the three of us were leaving the restaurant to spend what was already looking like the worst afternoon of my life. This was complete garbage. As Vilma and Mike continued to talk and flirt, I kept quiet, feeling horrible and realizing that this trip had been a huge mistake. Before returning to our hotel, we passed the creek where I had been forced to skinny dip years before. I couldn't even look at it without feeling like I was having an anxiety attack. Suddenly, Mike stopped, pushed Vilma aside and whispered something in her ear. She laughed and said it sounded great. I asked what they were talking about, and Mike, shamelessly, said there was no one around and we should try to do the same thing again, like when she and I were kids. That was the last straw. "Of course not," I shouted, completely outraged. "I'm going back to the hotel right now. Get the hell out of here." I paced furiously, but glanced over my shoulder and saw that they weren't moving. "I'll meet you there," Mike said. I felt completely betrayed and very hurt, but I didn't stop. When I was about 5 or 6 yards away from them, I turned to where they were, and then I saw Mike was taking off his shirt, and Ruth smiled at me in a teasing way. I turned away, gritting my teeth so they wouldn't see me cry. I walked back to the hotel alone and furious. Even though I'd had a hearty lunch, I ordered a bunch of stuff through room service to drown my sorrows in food. I ate and ate as I thought about how Mike had failed me in such a sleazy way. Was that why he wanted me to introduce him to my friends? He was a jerk, and I promised myself that when I got back to the hotel I would break up with him immediately. If that was how he was going to treat me, I didn't want him in my life. I spent hours waiting until finally the door to the room opened and Mike walked in. He was dressed, but his hair was still wet. "Where's Vilma?" I asked, furious. "Oh," he said matter-of-factly. "She's not coming." "That's nice," I said, as I turned my back to him and crossed my arms under my chest. He came up to me and tried to turn me around, but I pushed his arm away and kept my back to him. He sighed heavily and said, "Look, I saw right away how horrible she had been to you." Then America explained that he had taken her to the creek in hopes that I would come back to steal her clothes, just as he had done to me when we were children. "I thought we were on the same wavelength," he said, as I stared at him in disbelief. "How was I supposed to know that? Did you even tell me?" I replied. "Obviously I didn't realize," he said, "but it doesn't matter now. I improvised in the end, so it's all good now." That said, he walked toward the bathroom, taking off his shirt. I didn't quite understand what he meant by that last sentence, so I asked him, "What did you do with Vilma? Why didn't she come with you?" "Oh, it's just that she drowned in the creek," he said, as if he was talking about the weather. "What a shame." I was silent for a few seconds and then I asked him, feeling a little puzzled, "What did you say? Are you serious?" He came over, gave me a tight hug and a passionate kiss. I wanted to ask, but he wouldn't let me finish a sentence, just kissed me again, as if he was trying to evade me that way. Then he changed the subject about what we were going to do that night. The next morning, my older brother called me with news. Vilma's body had been found floating in the creek near the pig plant. At that moment, I knew Mike was telling me the truth. Vilma, my former best friend who had made my life a living hell, had died, and Mike, Well, let's just say he'd had something to do with it. When I hung up, he asked me what was wrong. "She's dead," I said, still looking at him in shock. He took a couple of steps and moved closer so that the tip of his nose was brushing mine, then asked, "Are you happy?" I should have been horrified, but instead, all I felt was absolute love for him. So I simply said, "Yes, thank you," and kissed him. Unfortunately, a witness had been hiding in some bushes nearby and saw the moment Mike drowned Vilma in the creek, and a couple of days later he was arrested and charged with premeditated murder. 2 years have passed since then, and Mike is still in prison serving a 30-year sentence. I, for one, went along with him through the process until last year and still keep in touch with him, but I am currently dating someone else and have plans to get married. I really regret what happened with Mike, not Vilma's death, but I didn't make him do it. I didn't even ask him to do it, so I have no guilt for that. A few months ago, I moved to a new city that is about an hour away from where I grew up. I moved into a nice house in a super quiet suburban community, very different from the noisy neighborhood where I spent my childhood. What surprised me most about my new home was realizing that my neighbor turned out to be an old childhood friend, Dean. If you had asked me who I never thought I would see again, Dean would have been at the top of that list. When we were kids, all of us in the neighborhood used to get together to play sports, play hide and seek, and ride bikes. Dean was one of my best friends in those days. We grew up in the late 80s and early 90s, so video games were just starting to gain popularity at that time, and Dean and I were the only ones in our group who were really hooked on them. We would spend hours playing indoors, although we also enjoyed playing outdoors with each other. I remember many nights when Dean would sleep over and we would spend the night playing. Those were fun times. Unfortunately, when I was in 5th grade, Dean and his family moved away. We tried to keep in touch with a few phone calls, but little by little we fell out of sight. When MySpace came along, we became friends on that network, but he was on his own thing, and to me, Dean was just a fuzzy memory. With Facebook, I almost didn't remember him, and I never thought of looking for him. Until one day I realized that my next-door neighbor was him. Crazy, don't you think? It was great to see my old childhood friend again. I was quite surprised that after moving to the West Coast, he now lived so close to where we grew up. I asked him why he decided to move back to this part of the country, and he just said he enjoyed the East Coast more, so I suggested we go out for a few beers and catch up. He agreed, and that night was set. Dean arrived at my house a few hours later with a couple of friends, a guy named Frank and his girlfriend Jane. I actually thought it was a little rude of him not to let me know he was coming with company. Not that it bothered me too much, but it's just not right for someone to invite you to their house and show up there with 2 strangers and without prior notice. Besides, it seemed a little strange to me from the beginning. As soon as they walked in, Frank and Jane started acting strange. They were kind of fascinated by everything in my living room. They kept looking around, as if they were taking a mental inventory of everything in my house. Another thing I could tell was that Frank and Jane were whispering to each other, and I don't know why, but it gave me a bad feeling. In the end, I felt really uncomfortable. Then I mentioned video games to Dean, asked him if he still played anything. His face changed and he laughed in a cocky way as he said, "No, dude. I quit video games when I was 12. That's kid stuff." I laughed nervously and tried to go with the joke. I replied that I probably missed the memo because not only was I still playing games, but I was also working in the industry. Everyone in the room laughed awkwardly, and suddenly the vibe changed. They seemed much more interested in what I was doing. Scott started bombarding me with questions about my computer, whether I used it for work and whether I was in a studio. I told him that I spent a lot of time working on my own computer and that I was developing a game for a fairly well-known company at the time. I shared all those details and, although the conversation flowed, I noticed that the mood had changed. When they left, I was left with a strange feeling, like something was out of place. The next day I saw Dean outside and greeted him as I went to my car to run some errands. He waved back but seemed frustrated about something. So I went home and spent the evening working on my game. At about 2 a.m., I got an alert on my phone. Someone was at my door. I have a motion camera in the driveway and a video doorbell, so I took a look to see what was going on. I pulled up the video from the camera and couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were 3 people standing on my doorsteps. They were all wearing clown masks and dark sweaters with hoods like Halloween costumes. They seemed to be deliberating about something. 2 of them were at the bottom and one was right in front of the door. The latter turned around, and while his back was to the camera, he began to hide something behind his waist. I zoomed in on the camera and could see exactly what it was. It was a gun, and with that one gesture, I knew exactly what he was up to. The guy in front of my door, after putting the gun away and signaling to those behind him, turned around again and started trying to open the door. I saw him turn the knob several times, and thank God it was securely locked. Then he took a couple of steps back and stood there looking at the knob, as if he was thinking about what to do next. But just at that moment, one of his accomplices saw the doorbell camera and, in a loud voice, yelled something at it, and then the guy in front of my door leaned over to get a good look at the camera. Even though he had a mask on, for me there was no doubt that guy was Dean, which quickly led me to deduce that the other 2 behind him must have been Frank and Jane, the same ones he had brought to my house earlier, and that he kept looking around, catching everything inside my house. When he realized that there was indeed a camera, his eyes widened like saucers, like who knows what has been caught. Jane, realizing the situation, ran in the opposite direction of Dean's house. She stopped for a second, but then came back and started jiggling the door handle, trying to get in again. He said something under his breath that I couldn't make out, and then he ran out as well. I immediately called the police, sent them the pictures and told them everything. Dean didn't show up in the neighborhood again for days, probably because he realized he was going to have to answer for his actions, but it did him little good to try to hide, as he was caught a week later. He was so reckless that he tried to enter his house in the wee hours of the morning, but I had him well guarded, as I had placed a sensor on his door as well, so as soon as he tried to enter, my alarm went off and I immediately called the police. They arrived very quickly, and within minutes Dean was arrested. It turns out that after I reported him, they were able to make connections with a series of break-ins in the area. The final kicker for Dean and his cronies was that another house they burglarized weeks ago also had a camera, and on that occasion, they weren't wearing masks. It was sad to see how someone I once held so dear had sunk into such a dark world. Thanks to those security cameras, I was saved from big trouble. And, even though I live in a neighborhood that feels pretty safe, you never know. So never underestimate the possibility of a robbery, or worse, no matter where you live. Without those cameras, I might not be here sharing this story today. Another important piece of advice I can give you is that you should never trust someone you haven't seen in years, no matter how close friends you may have been in the past. Years go by and people change, some for the better, and some definitely for the worse. This story starts when I was in 5th grade, so I was about 10 years old at the time. I was a little younger than my other classmates, which made me not fit in very well with them. So every time we went out for recess, I took a book with me to distract me. I had a favorite corner in the playground, a quiet place where almost no one went. It was a patch full of clover and overgrown plants, with a big bush that created a space between it and the fence. I loved to sit there and read or do anything. It was like a kind of refuge for me. One day, when I went to my special corner and settled in with my back to the bush, I was enjoying my reading when I heard a rustling sound behind me. Sometimes squirrels and other creatures moved through that space, so I didn't think too much of it. However, then I heard heavy breathing and felt something tugging on my hair. Startled, I shook my head thinking that my hair had gotten caught on a branch or something, but to my horror, I discovered that there was a boy hunched over in the gap between the fence and the bush, peeking through the leaves and trying to grab my hair. At that moment, I did what any 10-year-old girl would do. I screamed loudly and ran off towards the area where the teachers were. I was too shy back then, so I didn't tell anyone what had happened to me at the tree. But after that, I preferred to stay close to the teachers during recess. Later in the school year, I made a friend who we'll call Lucas. Lucas was also a bit of an outcast, and when we were paired up for a reading group, we became best friends. He was really nice, but honestly, something wasn't right with him. He was too clingy, never moving away from me, and constantly looking for excuses to touch me and get too close. Even though I had no other friends around me, it really made me uncomfortable. One day, when we were about halfway through the course or so, Lucas confessed to me that he liked me, and I honestly didn't know how to react to that, so I just kept quiet. And apparently he interpreted my silence as "I like you too," or something like that. Later that night, he called me at home. My mom handed me the phone, saying a friend wanted to talk to me, so I decided to go up to my room so I wouldn't disturb my parents who were watching TV. When I answered, I didn't even have time to say hello before he started saying really weird things, like, "What do you want us to name our kids? Where would you like us to get married? Do you want us to have a combined name like the Hollywood stars?" I was really confused and overwhelmed, since, as I told you, I was shy and didn't know how to handle that, so I just cut him off. When we got to high school, Lucas blurted out one of those weird, "let's run away and start a family" kind of phrases. That would be disturbing to anyone, but I was only 10 at the time and he was only about 11 or 12, so I was really overwhelmed by his questions and weird comments. That's why I decided to stay away from him. He made me uneasy, and that made me want to stay away. But no matter what I did, he would always look at me and stay close to me, which was extremely uncomfortable, and I wasn't happy about that. Eventually, we reached the end of the school year, and during the vacations I had no contact with him. When we started the next school year, i.e. 6th grade, I honestly had a giant problem with bullying. It got so bad that my dad decided one day that he wasn't going to wait until the next school year and that we were going to change schools the following Monday. Entering this new school was a break for me, and from there, my parents bought me my first phone. Of course, the first thing I did was to call Clara, who had become my best friend during the vacations after Lucas. She was also studying at my old school, but she lived near my house, and it was during the summer vacations that we became closer. The thing is, I called her to tell her that I now had a phone, and she was very excited because now we could always be in touch. A couple of months went by, and one night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I froze when I heard Lucas's voice. I clearly remember what he said. "Hey babe, I've missed you so much. Why did you leave me?" Without thinking, I hung up, blocked his number, and called Clara, who was the only one at my old school with my new number. It turns out that after class, Lucas had gotten Clara to let him use her phone because he had forgotten his. She, being so nice but a bit naive, didn't realize that something weird was going on. But then she noticed that he was taking his time and was writing something on his arm. Clara told me that when she realized that, she took the phone away from him, and seeing him panicking, realized that he had opened my contact. I freaked out when Clara told me that, but I felt safe because I had already blocked him. Still, that didn't stop him. Every week he would call me from a different number, leaving about 10 messages each time. Every time I blocked one number, he would manage to call from another. When they finally bought me another phone, the calls stopped and I finally managed to forget about him. However, in freshman year of high school, I ran into some kids from my old school and suddenly remembered Lucas. I asked one of them, Terry, if he knew what had happened to him. According to Terry, he had been expelled from school. The teachers caught him several times, sniffing and touching girls' hair, trying to sneak into the locker room and writing super weird stuff about him and other girls in the class. Hearing that, I got a weird feeling, like I'd been hit by a truck. I clearly remembered the boy hiding in the bush and realized that Lucas's situation was much more serious than I had imagined. Fortunately, a few months later, I learned that he and his family had moved to another city, and that was a great relief to me. Since then, I have not seen him again until today. Once upon a time in the 1980s, when my mom was a teenager in high school, She and her sister grew up on a farm lost in Central Florida, a pretty out-of-the-way place back then. It's more urban now, but back then there were only woods and fields around. Her aunt and cousins lived in another house on the same property, so they weren't totally alone. However, to get to the next house took a long time in the car, probably cutting through a dusty road. My grandfather was the coach of the town school soccer team, while my mom and her sister were the cheerleaders. On Fridays, it was almost a tradition for them to go cheer for the family, as their cousins also went to the same school, and I don't know what was wrong with them, but there wasn't a single more exciting plan in that little place on a Friday night. Grandpa almost always got to the game before anyone else because he was the coach, but on one particular Friday, my mom felt terrible during the day. By evening, she didn't even feel like going, so she told my grandfather she would stay home and rest. My grandmother made her some dinner, and after that, the family, including aunt and uncle, left for the game, so my mom was left alone in the house, which, by the way, we ended up selling when I was very young, so my memories of that property are somewhat vague. The only thing I remember is that it got very creepy at night, even with people around, so I can't imagine how scary it must have been for my mom to be alone there. She got into bed right after the others left, but it wasn't long before she realized she needed to let her cheerleading coach know about her absence that night. Remember, this is the 1980s, so there were no cell phones, so she had to get up and walk to the kitchen to use the house phone, feeling more and more uneasy as she went through the house. That feeling that something wasn't right, that intuition that tells you you might be in trouble, began to tighten her stomach. It was already getting dark outside, and there weren't many lights on in the house, which made the tension worse. Oh, and something very important. The phone in the grandparents' house had a longer cord than normal. At the time, my mom tells me that the phone cord was so long that she could walk around the house without worry. Like she could pull the phone out of the kitchen and take it to other rooms, the living room, the hallway, and even the grandparents' room, which was next door. My grandfather always had a shotgun hanging on the wall, ready to use in case of emergency. I don't know if it's the safest way to live, but if you're in the middle of the woods, it's a good idea to be prepared, right? I always told my mom and her brothers not to touch that shotgun unless they were in real danger. She took it very seriously and had never thought of going near that gun. Just then, while she was in the kitchen, she dialed her trainer's number to let her know she was sick. They were chatting for a couple of minutes until suddenly, my mom started hearing strange noises coming from the grandparents' room. With her heart pounding, she told the trainer that she heard something and quickly grabbed the shotgun from the wall. She had the phone to her ear, feeling a little silly for being scared, but decided to open the door to her parents' room. What she saw made her drop the phone on the floor in shock. Upon entering the grandparents' room, my mother noticed that the window was wide open, and there was a huge guy with one leg over the sill and the other still out, as if he was about to come in. The situation was so awkward that the guy just stood there, right in the middle of her driveway, as if he had never imagined he would find anyone at home. They both stared at each other for about 5 seconds. She, paralyzed under the doorframe with the phone to her ear and the gun in her hands, and he, standing in the middle of the window, both of them not knowing what to do. My poor mother, scared to death, finally summoned up some courage and spoke in a very low voice, almost stuttering. She managed to tell him that she had a gun and for the guy to turn around and leave, or she was going to shoot him. This man seemed to question whether or not she was joking. After what seemed like an eternity to my mom staring at each other, suddenly, the guy swung his other leg around quickly and moved as if he was going to attack her. My mom, terrified and with her hand shaking, fired the shotgun and hit him in the shoulder. The impact was so brutal that my mom was knocked to the ground and the guy flew out the window. When she looked up at the window, she noticed blood splattered everywhere around the frame. She, shaking and sobbing, grabbed the phone again and asked her trainer to call the police. She walked shakily to the window and looked out, expecting to see the guy's dead body on the other side, but instead she saw the man running, clutching his injured shoulder, running across the yard and disappearing into the woods behind her house. I mean, remember, he had shot him in the shoulder with a shotgun, not a toy revolver, and the guy just got up like it was nothing and crawled off into the woods. I'm not sure of the exact order of what happened next, but eventually, the police arrived on the scene. My grandparents, concerned, returned home shortly thereafter, and there were still officers there, investigating. The strangest part of the whole thing was that the guy left a trail of blood as he fled, a trail that led into the woods. The police followed the trail, and a couple of days later they found out who it was. The man who was trying to break into my grandparents' house that night was a guy named John Walker, and he turned out to be a former co-worker of my grandfather, a guy in his 30s at the time, who they later found out was connected to other burglaries that had occurred locally. My grandfather was very upset and quite surprised, as this man and he used to be very good friends in the past, but it seems that the guy started having problems with alcohol consumption and gambling addiction, which led to him losing his job and getting into trouble. Definitely, friends we see, bad intentions we know. I had a friend, we'll call him Tom, who was obsessed with the paranormal, and in fact I was the one who got him into that world. We both had a mutual taste for the weird and strange, so I thought he might like to talk about it, but he ended up getting so into it that he wouldn't talk about anything else. He would even interrupt conversations just to get the talk back on track to the paranormal. A little annoying, but I understand that sometimes people get into phases where they just want to talk about what they're passionate about. Tom didn't have a very large group of friends, and his depression coupled with the way he was kept him in a tight circle. He hadn't had very good luck with girls either, so his world was pretty limited. But I always enjoyed spending time with him, so I tried to be a good friend. I didn't want to ignore him just because he was getting a little weird. Overall, he'd been a normal guy. We used to chat and play on the PlayStation. Sometimes we'd go to the movies with my girlfriend, and sometimes we'd just hang out in the park or go swimming. Typical stuff. We really had fun. However, things started to change when Tom started smoking DMT. Personally, I think psychedelics can give you some pretty profound insights, but you have to have respect for them. But Tom dove in head first. He got so into it that, after doing some research, he started smoking it several times a day. For those not in the know, smoking DMT is like being teleported to a parallel world. You and your body cease to exist and you just explore an alternate, dreamlike reality. My only experience with this substance led me to see a pterodactyl in a kaleidoscope of craziness. Imagine what that does to a person who smokes it more than 30 times a day. As you can imagine, after this hallucinogenic bomb, my friend was not at his best mentally, so he started telling me super weird things, like he was the reincarnation of Tutankhamun, and claimed he was seeing Egyptian hieroglyphics everywhere in his daily life. He said he had talked to entities in his room, even when he wasn't smoking DMT. Obviously, it worried me a lot, and I told him that he needed to take a big break from drugs for a while to reconnect with reality. I was still hanging out with him because I needed help, and as I mentioned before, I didn't have a lot of friends to tell him that. Plus, he was the black sheep of the family, and he knew his family wasn't supporting him. I was very close to his younger brother, so I decided to message him on Facebook to tell him my concerns. I asked him to talk to him about the possibility of him seeking professional help, because things were getting to the point of no return. I don't know if he really took my messages seriously, since we didn't even know each other that well, and besides, he was at least 6 years younger than us. Maybe he didn't understand how serious everything was getting. Anyway, we got to the part where things got really ugly. My girlfriend had planned to spend some time in the park with Tom. I didn't want to go, really. I felt like I needed a break from his crazy talks. But my girlfriend insisted that it wouldn't be so bad, so we decided to go. When we arrived, there was Tom, as usual, talking about Egypt and gods that only he knew about. He also had a big hunting knife that he kept fiddling with. During our walk, he told us that he had been using it to do ceremonial magic and that it helped him ward off negative thoughts. It started to make me very uncomfortable. He was making motions with the knife as if he was pretending to stab himself while still talking to us. I think both my girlfriend and I were quite nervous, not knowing what to do. I tried to change the subject to distract him, but he was still going through his ritual. Considering we were on a park trail, we couldn't just say goodbye. We had to walk back to our car and leave him in his. The atmosphere felt tense, and I just wanted to run out of there if possible. Tom had never been violent in any way, but in the last few months his mental state had been in free fall, and frankly, one didn't know what he might come out with. So after that awkward walk, my girlfriend had the amazing idea that we should go to lunch. I was trying to give her that please don't look, like she was crazy for wanting to spend more time with Tom. But I don't know if she didn't understand me or just decided to ignore my body language, because in the end, I ended up getting in the car, me driving, my girlfriend in the passenger seat, and our weird friend in the back. As we crossed a busy area of town full of stores and restaurants, I hear the sound of a belt unbuckling and a zipper opening, and then a sound that sounded familiar. I took a deep breath and prayed to God it wasn't what I was thinking, but then, out of the corner of my eye, my worst suspicions were confirmed. Tom, well, let's just say he was being affectionate with himself in the back seat. I mean, pants down and all. I started to feel a knot in my stomach, and all the anxiety I had accumulated during the day came rushing out. I was trying not to shake as I drove through traffic. Seriously, my mind went blank. All I could think about was that huge knife in my pocket that was now totally out of my mind. I was afraid to confront him. I didn't know what reaction he might have. The craziest thing about this is that my girlfriend didn't notice anything and was still chatting away about things I wasn't even listening to. My thoughts were only on how to drive and act like I didn't know what was going on behind me. We finally arrived at the restaurant, and my girlfriend ran out to get some food. I stayed alone in the car with Tom, trying to pretend I was checking my phone, even though I was actually listening to every move he made. We didn't talk at all, and when my girlfriend came back, I complained that I was tired, that it had been a long day, and that we'd better get going. So we got back in the car with our friend, and I drove back to the parking lot where her car was parked. I let him know we had arrived, but he didn't get out immediately. He just sat there, and I was getting uncomfortable and starting to lose my patience, so I rudely told him to please get in his car and go home. Finally, he got out of my car, but instead of heading to his car, he went over to the passenger side, where my girlfriend was. At that moment, I was scared to death, because I saw that before he got out, he pulled out a gun from a bag he had on the seat. I don't know what happened in my head at that moment, but I was so furious that I just got out of my car and walked straight towards him. He was about 3 feet away, and I could see it was a loaded 9mm. I kept asking him repeatedly what the hell he was doing, because that was all I could think about at the time. I urged him to get in his car and go home, but he wouldn't say anything. He was just crying, and had a wild look in his eyes, which made me even more uneasy. For some reason, Tom finally listened to me, got back in his car and left. I told my girlfriend that we were never going to date that guy again, and that I really didn't want to talk to him again, so I just ignored any attempt at contact he made. A few months went by, and every now and then he would send me Facebook or text messages saying nonsensical things, which I, of course, ignored. Turns out he moved to Illinois, near Chicago. I have no idea why, but it seems he had a friend there. A family member or an ex-girlfriend was over there. Truth be told, I don't know what was up with his life. Maybe he was trying to change things up and start over. I thought it best to cut ties completely and let him settle in as he could. I definitely didn't feel like maintaining any friendships with him, and it was clear he needed help that I couldn't offer. But one day, I sort of had a feeling and decided to talk to his brother to tell him that this guy had a gun and that maybe I should try to get him away from it. He was concerned and thanked me for telling him. Somehow his brother managed to get the gun away from him, but in the end, it didn't do much good. One night around 1 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by a call from a guy claiming to be a detective in a small town in Illinois. My heart dropped to the floor when I heard Illinois, because I only knew one person in that place, and of course it was Tom. I broke out in a cold sweat and asked him what had happened. Apparently my old friend had stabbed someone in an Egyptian museum. I don't have all the details, and the information I've been able to find is pretty limited, but this all feels so surreal. Honestly, I feel like I was lucky I didn't end up badly that day in the park. I still feel unsettled by this whole horrible experience, and even just writing this makes me cringe.